So it is my pleasure to introduce Athlone Clarke this evening. He was born in Jamaica in 1956 and immigrated to the United States in 1985, facing an entirely new reality. And this provided him an opportunity to reinvent himself while tapping into the other basics of day-to-day survival. The one thing that remained constant from his childhood was the desire to paint. Clarke considers himself as embodying the belief that honest art will always attract an audience who is both willing and capable of looking beyond just decorative appeal. His work is collected both nationally and internationally, and when asked what is the greatest lesson he has taken away from all his years as a working artist, his answer is surprisingly simple: art saves lives, and I have to agree with that. Thank you so much for joining us, Athlone. I'd like to start out with a maybe simple sounding question, but could you tell us a little bit about how you got started in art and a little bit about your background?
So, as you mentioned earlier, I grew up in Jamaica, and I lost my mother at a very early age while I was an infant. And I think my grandmother, in order to kind of, I guess you'd say, soothe me or keep me distracted from the darker side of life, she would say that if I painted or if I wrote little notes, that somehow my mother would be able to read them. You know, as a 2, 3, 4-year-old child, I totally believe that. But my mother also was an artist. I would say probably more of a hobbyist. And I would go around the house and I would see, you know, little sketches and little things that she had written over time. And so I was totally convinced that she and I had some kind of written, or shall I say, tangible way of communicating through my art and my letters and so on and so forth. So at that age, I kind of started, as we would say, dabbling and not really necessarily thinking of it as art, but rather just as an exercise, you know. As I got older, in high school, before I even got to high school, I remember my father, the one thing he was always proud about is that he would bring his friends over and he would say, "This is what my boy did," and he would hold up the pictures and he would put them on the wall and all of that. And of course, as a young man, I needed that kind of reassurance. And as I got older, I got more into it. But then when I was 16, 17, I remember doing a drawing and showing it to him. And if I remember correctly, his response was more in the like of, "You're grown now, and it's kind of time to put away that kind of childish exercise." And, you know, I was a little confused because I thought he liked it. I thought it was something happy grown-ups did, you know, but the way he put it was that he wasn't about to see me ending up on the beaches in Jamaica selling cheap souvenirs to tourists. And that's just the way he saw art, as just purely kind of a touristy type of stuff that the Rastamen on the beach did in terms of their carvings and stuff like that. But, you know, by that time, the roots had started to be established. And so I got to high school. I did, you know, okay in high school. But then I noticed that the art room, we call it the art room, was behind the school. And the kids who wanted to pad their curriculum or wanted to, you know, have something extra to do would find their way in the art room. But I had good teachers, except that it wasn't something that was considered to be a long-term goal. It was just something that was used to fill a gap until you figured out what you wanted to do. And I threw myself into it, and I was maybe the only boy in high school to do what was considered advanced level art. I will be perfectly honest with you. I also used it as a way of padding my qualifications, because if I had passed art at the A-level standard, then it would mean my chance of getting into university would be a whole lot better. So I did it, not thinking that I wanted to be an artist, but just as a stepping stone, if you will. And as it turned out, I got a pretty decent grade in my A-level art and went off to college and completely forgot about art. You know, it had served its purpose and I was done with it. And I went off to law school. And on graduating, I practiced for a while, but I don't know, I kind of always felt like it wasn't a good fit, in the sense that I would agonize over going to work. I would agonize about being in the office. I would agonize about dealing with clients. I didn't like too much paperwork and minutiae and all that kind of stuff. But the money was decent. And at that point, you know, I can't remember exactly when it was, but it kind of got to a crisis point where I decided that life is too short to spend it doing something just for money. You know, there has to be passion in it, or else it dies on the vine. And so I didn't know how to make the transition. And the only thing I could think of was what I've always done in my life, was just to escape, run away, go somewhere where nobody knows me, or a few people know me. And, you know, you'll hear the typical immigrant story. I came seeking a better life. In my case, it wasn't exactly true. I came seeking adventure, you know, because I'd already had a good life. So I kept, you know, I came and I dabbled here, I dabbled there. But the one thing that became something of a cultural shock was that nobody cares what you were doing back at home. You have to prove yourself all over again. And here was I, the last time I did art was in high school. And so for a long time, I just, you know, just did little things that were considered, at least I would consider them just to be kind of puerile and, you know, just a way of taking my mind off stuff. But after a while, things got really, really difficult, because I had been here for about 2 years and, you know, I hadn't had a steady job. It was just little jobs here, little jobs there. I started to wonder if I'd made a bad decision. And so as it turned out, 40 years later, it wasn't such a bad decision after all.
Thank you. So if you'd like, I can get started with some questions. So my first question, I'm hoping to kind of contextualize it within the exhibition itself. So the title of this exhibition, Cross Kalunga by the Stars and Other Acts of Resistance, is centered around the Kikongo word kalunga, which means threshold between worlds. And your work seems to literally reflect that concept, in that the figures and the objects on your canvases exist in two planes at once. And the here and the there, and the now and the then, and the then almost, and creating what you've described as a portal. And so how do you hope viewers of your work in this exhibition specifically, with this concept of kalunga and threshold in mind, what kind of function do you hope that these portals serve for viewers of your work?
As far as portals are concerned, I must confess that it is only over the last maybe 5 or 7 years it has become a part of my lexicon. You know, and I began to understand that there are different realities around us, where I guess they would describe it as kind of a parallel universe. And I'd kind of always seen myself as kind of living between two worlds. You know, I say that only to describe the fact that I still am rooted in my Jamaican past. I'm also rooted in my present here with my family. So in other words, I still consider Jamaica home, but I also consider home wherever my family is. So in that respect, I'm living in the world of the past as well as the world of the present. But I also believe that a lot of what I do, I remember as a young man, and this is, I swear to you, this is one of the weirdest stories. I was at an art and craft show and this old lady came in and she was in a wheelchair and a young man was pushing her chair, and she sat in front of one of my paintings for a good 5-10 minutes. And I was curious as to what she saw in my work. And so I asked her, I said, you know, trying to be friendly, I said, "You like it?" She said, "I like it very much." I said, "What does it say to you?" And she said, "If I told you, you would understand." And I was like, whoa, that's a little weird. I mean, it's my work. I would like to think that I understood. And as it turns out, this is the weird part. She was actually blind. I did not realize that her grandson, or the person who was pushing her, I assume was her grandson, explained that she was blind. And for a minute, I thought it must be some kind of a joke. But I remember she asked me a couple of questions about the painting. And I was like, well, I did this. The reason I did that was because at the time I thought this would be a good idea, and I did this and I did that. And I was going on and she stopped me and she said, "I noticed you use a lot of I's." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You say I did this and I did that. I don't believe you did all of this. I think it came through you. I think maybe you're tapping into another source, a higher source, but it sounds to me like you're taking all the credit for it." And at the time I thought it was a little rude, but once I got home and I started thinking about it, I realized she was absolutely right, because I'm a conduit, I'm a vessel. And this is not to say that my work is of some higher spiritual order. It just means that I'm tapping into something that allows me to decipher what the symbols and the images are. And from what I can remember of these visions, I tend to put them on camera, on canvas. But there's also that side where the resistance aspect of it, the reason I thought it was relevant to what I do, or what I'm doing, particularly with this show in mind, is that I don't know if it's a criticism, but it has been observed that I don't really have a style. A friend said to me, he said, "You want to do work that if somebody steals your work and take it Tokyo, somebody would just look and say, oh, that's an Athlone Clarke." And I struggled for a long time trying to find a style. But then I started to realize that finding a style is a way of participating in the building of my own prison. Because that's not how my mind works, you know, and I cannot just assimilate just to get along. In other words, I don't have the same thing for breakfast every morning, because that's not how my mind works. That's not how my appetite works. So when I get up on a particular day, I might want to just nail some stuff together. I don't want to paint. I just want to, you know, sometimes I collect old photographs. Sometimes I just want to go through photographs and just see where they're relevant in what I'm doing. And quite frankly, sometimes I start things without having any clue whatsoever where it's going. And the reason I work, I like to think of myself as working spontaneously. And the reason I like working spontaneously is because at the end of it all, I want it to be a surprise to me, as well as the person who is seeing it for the first time. Getting back to your question about portals, I feel as if Maybe it sounds a little bit grandiose, but I feel as if I've been chosen to bring a certain message. And the message might not be decipherable in my lifetime, but it is my wish that maybe in the year 2056, someone will see some kind of relevance in what I do. Anansi would be the perfect example of living between two worlds. Anansi is a mythical figure in Jamaica. He's part spider and he's part human. And he gets himself in situations where he has to be crafty and he has to have a certain ingenuity to get through. So he's seen kind of as a little bit of a trickster, if you will. A kind of shape-shifting trickster, double-talking kind of entity. But the reason I like Anansi, not only because I've heard many stories about him growing up, but my personal reason is that when I was young, and even now, one of the ideas that has been attributed to him, or one of the quotes that has been attributed to him, is that you should always play the fool to catch the wise. What that basically means is that sometimes you have to act stupid, so people think you're stupid, so they reveal themselves to you, and that way you can make the necessary moves in order to protect yourself or protect your family, because they've seen you at a point where you're probably, they think you're vulnerable, you're naive, all of that stuff. And so that part of them comes out because they think you're not able to decipher it because you're too simple-minded. But Anansi believes that that's one of the best strategies that you could use, because it helps you to see people the way they are, in the truest sense of the word, not trying to impress or anything like that. He also lives between two worlds because he lives in the mythical world, but he also visits the real world and he gives advice. And he's also a jokester. You know, if you hear Anansi's story, you probably end up laughing for days. You know, so I find Anansi to be an entity that gives me some guidance, and an entity that shows me that things are not just black and white, that there are nuances that we have to consider as we exist in this lifetime.
Great. And can I ask you, just, hi, audience, welcome. I'm Zoe Starling, Curator of Education. We're glad to have you here this evening. Can you talk a little bit more about the symbolism in this painting specifically?
Well, I'll have to be perfectly honest here. Sometimes I put things on my painting just out of pure intuition. You know, they don't always necessarily have a deep significance. But in this case, you happen to have picked one that there's some things that I can maybe explain a little bit better. So these are chessboards. And I'm sure you've heard in life, there's a big difference between playing chess and playing checkers. And if you want to survive in this life, it's very important to learn how to play chess. And it's a game that requires a lot of patience. And that's why the chess pieces are around him. So in other words, he's studying the complexities of life through a chess game. This is a medicine bag where it says S. I guess you could interpret the S as meaning spirit. But in his medicine bag, he carries these unknown substances that helps him to navigate life and helps him to heal and helps him to make people laugh and all of that. I've always believed in crystals, you know, and so I had to add a little bit of crystal there because I think crystals represent light or enlightenment, let's put it that way. And so I always have, you know, little pieces of crystals in my work when I can find them. And Professor Emeritus of Everything African. You know, I first knew about Anansi when I was a boy. And he's not as active in my life as when I was a kid and loved hearing stories about him. So in the sense, I kind of consider him somewhat retired, but also having still having very important knowledge and information that he can share with most of us. And so that's why I said Professor Emeritus of everything African, but not just everything African, everything common sense. That's the important thing as well. Everything common sense, because common sense rules. You know what I mean? Did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I'll ask one more in this space before we move to the next gallery. Specifically, I wanted to jump to this one because you mentioned the chessboards that you've placed onto this canvas. And so there's another work in the exhibition called Masters of the Game, which is an installation by Andre Leon Gray. He's an artist from Raleigh here. And so I wanted to know if, now that you've had the opportunity to see this exhibition yourself and experience it yourself, how do you feel that the work of these other artists interacts with yours and vice versa?
So this morning when I walked in, I was completely blown away. Not only is the space beautiful, but I think the work ties in quite nicely. I can't speak for what the other artists are thinking of when they're working, but what I can say is that I'm extremely honored, very proud to be showing with them. I have been in shows before where I walked in and I try not to criticize people's work, but sometimes I think, okay, it is what it is. In this particular instance, I can say I'm thoroughly impressed with the work that is here. Notice I wore my dress shirt. I don't bring out this shirt for regular
Very
people.
nice.
But yeah, I think it, especially Renee Stout, I think is the name, this artist.
Yes.
And in the corner, I think she's a brilliant artist. And all of the artists here, I think, are what we call top shelf.
Okay, Athlone, you worked as a professional writer at one point in your career. What role does language and written word play in your work, whether it be pre-printed, found object materials, or hand-painted words and phrases?
I think language is everything. I think words help us to decipher language. But I think language is beyond or transcends words. I think me using words as a writer definitely has bled over into my visual work, because again, I mentioned the year 2056. I only say 2056 because it's 100 years from my birth year, but I would like to think that someone who sees a painting and might not necessarily understand it at first glance, there might be a word that might clue them in as to what was going through my mind at the particular time when I was making that painting. I also see language as being very helpful in terms of just me being able to keep track of what I'm doing. It helps me to communicate in a way that few would understand while I'm working. Because again, I said, I tend to work in the moment. I have all these ideas and thoughts running through my head. And even though I haven't really been a professional writer in a long time, I still have dreams of one day doing this book, maybe, that will go beyond even my visual work. But the funny thing about the visual work is that it is not limited necessarily to words. So it actually transcends words, you know what I mean? Because it takes you in so many different directions. I hope I haven't oversimplified the answer. I think language, you can look at a painting and you can have, it's an abstract piece and you're thinking, what is this? But then just that one word, if used properly, can pull the person into the depth of what the painting is about. So you write the word visionary, and the person thinks, oh, it means I don't necessarily have to understand it on a literal level. It means that I'm free to open up and maybe project my own interpretation onto the piece. Or the word free, or the word interpret as you will. It kind of welcomes people into the painting. And the last thing I'll say about that is that paintings, art, there are a lot of people who find art to be intimidating because they feel like you have to be some kind of professor, some kind of luminary, some kind of academic to understand it, and they don't want to look stupid. So they either agree with everything or they stand off. And I happen to think that, at least I don't want to participate in that kind of elitism. I don't mind explaining my work if somebody asks me. You know what I mean? Of course, it helps to be mysterious, but by nature, I guess I'm not a mysterious guy. If you ask me what this means, I'm going to do my best to explain what it means. And I understand that in the art world, that's not cool. You have to be mysterious. But then again, I'm not trying to be like everybody else. I am who I am. Maybe I'm a chatterbox. Maybe that's what it is. I'm a chatterbox who likes to paint.
It's a fun thing to be. So we actually are getting some questions from those that are watching. So I have two so far. So I'd like to start with this one because we just touched on your past experience as a writer. We have a question about your time as a lawyer. So, or relevant to that. So Rich Holly asks, what could the law profession learn and benefit from when it comes to the arts?
Well, the one thing I learned was that I was not cut out for it. That's my first thing. In other words, it's a great profession for people who have that kind of drive. But I think one of my greatest blessings is that at an early age, I understood where my limitations were, and I understood what I wanted my life to be like. And part of, my friend Roger and I were talking this morning, and he mentioned the compulsion to create. I've always had that compulsion to create. And, unfortunately, the law doesn't give you as much room to create as being a painter does or being an artist does. No, he wants to know what I learned as a lawyer that I find relevant in what I do.
What the law profession in general could learn from the arts.
Honestly, I think the law profession for me, and by the way, it's the first time ever speaking about the law profession in any detail, because it's not something I choose to focus on only because it tends to bring me back there. And, I'm kind of done with back there in terms of profession. But I think that all the law did for me was to maybe open up my mind, where I read more, I interpreted situations maybe a little bit faster. I tend to be at times very analytic about certain things. But I'm going to kick myself later on for even mentioning that aspect of my life, only because there is kind of a knee-jerk reaction when people hear lawyer. Oh, you know what I'm saying? And for me, it was just something that I got into because maybe I needed some kind of structure, something to figure out life about. My father thought it was a great idea because, he figured I'd never go hungry. I'd have a good bread and butter profession. But it has its constraints. And I got to a point where I realized that this is what I want to spend my life doing. I don't want to be in courthouses. I don't need fine print. I don't need a lot of academia type stuff. I just need to paint. I have a compulsion to create. That's it. So as far as the law thing is concerned, it was just a blip in my life. It was a minor detail.
Thank you. So another question is, are there other examples of Jamaican mythology or folklore in your work that you return to often?
There is a guy called Big Boy, and I will not, I mean, he's very, very X-rated. I don't know why they were telling little kids those stories back then, but, you know, the value system was different back then. But, you know, there is Big Boy, there's a Nancy, a few others that I can't remember right now, but I think Anansi is maybe the first one I've done that really highlights Anansi and Big Boy. I have a Big Boy piece at home. It's the first piece that I've done where, you know, I've actually brought Jamaican, well, it's really not Jamaican, it's African mythology as interpreted by Jamaicans.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought it out in my painting that we looked on before, but outside of that, no, it's
Okay. So then some of the figures in your paintings are these characters that you create?
I create the characters, and honestly, I don't always know where they're heading, but by the time I'm done, I have a pretty good idea, or in the middle of the painting, I have a pretty good idea of who these characters are as they introduce themselves to me. I prefer to create my own characters, you know, because that way I can get them to do what I want them to do. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
At the Gregg Museum, we have a number of different university classes that come through to see our rotating exhibitions, and we have a number of English students already who have attended this exhibition. One class in particular seemed drawn to Portal 2020 and likened part of the canvas to the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was active in New York in the 1980s. Who are your biggest artistic influences and how do they manifest in your work?
So, without question, the great, great, great Jean-Michel Basquiat. I have no shame in saying that he has influenced my work tremendously. And I think only, not so much because of his fame, but I think the freedom that he exhibited when he worked. And, you know, for the most part, you know, there were guys like Jean Dubuffet who, you know, did similar work. But Jean-Michel, I think maybe also because he was of Caribbean heritage like myself, I identified with the work that he did. And I honestly think that he's one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. And to have lived to only 28 years old, and that's remarkable. So definitely he influences my work. But then there's also people like Robert Rauschenberg, who works with objects, found objects, like, you know, takes it into on a completely different level. I admire his work a lot. And then in terms of contemporaries, the great, great, great Lonnie Holly, the great Charlie Lucas, the great, well, he's gone now, Thornton Dial. You know, there are a lot of people that have influenced my work. This again, going back to the whole idea of portal, maybe it's grandiose of me to think this way, but I need it in order to continue. So I convinced myself that a lot of these artists that have gone on visit me from time to time to share little ideas. It's my little fairy tale, and I'm sticking to it. I like it.
Thank you. Yes, the class that came through and made that connection was an art history class, and they had just learned about Jean-Michel Basquiat, and they were really drawn to that painting and couldn't stop talking about how that,
Mentioning that.
yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know about Jean-Michel until I lived here for maybe about 5 or 6 years, and I thought, man, I wish I'd met that dude. Because I mean, he was just so prolific, and he worked. It was like poetry and all of that. And you know, I've always I've heard it before where people say your work reminds me of Basquiat. I do believe I have my own, because I work with found objects, so I do believe I have my own identity and I have my own style. But any association with Jean-Michel, I see it as a compliment. He has his style, or I shouldn't say style, but he has his way of working. I have my way of working, and he's definitely someone I look up to, whose work I look up to, I should say.
Yeah. So you just mentioned that you work with found objects. And so I have a question related to that. And that is inspired by the Japanese concept of Tsuku Mogami. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Could you tell us about this Japanese folk belief and how you became acquainted with it and how it informs your artistic process?
Well, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but I do know what it is. So they believe, the Japanese believe that, when I said Japanese, certain Japanese philosophers believe that if an object is over 100 years old, it has inherited kind of a soul. And living in America, I've discovered that it's kind of a throwaway society in the sense that we use something for its function, and then once it gets old, we toss it. And we unfortunately do it with people as well. I like the idea that if something had served you for decades, that when it gets old and non-functional, that even though it might be non-functional, it still has all that energy. In other words, think of a pot that you used to cook food for 20, 30 years. So now it's old because it has holes in the bottom. Do you toss it in the garbage? Or do you say, you know what? I'm going to make a nice flower pot with this stuff. I'm going to give it a new lease on life. I'm going to say thank you for the work that you have done. Because even though it's an inanimate object, it still has atoms. And there are people who believe that even inanimate objects are alive, but on a different plane. So I feel like when I find these objects and I incorporate them into my work, it's my way of saying, thank you for your existence. You may have been overlooked in the past, but now I'm going to make sure that whenever someone sees this particular painting, that you are also celebrated. But I also feel like, because objects are so random, you still have to have a compositional sense. You can't just throw them. I guess you can if you want. There's no have to in art. You can do whatever you want to do. But in my particular case, I like to use them in a way where at least I think they complement each other. And as I've always said, an analogy, it's like having a choir. Each member of the choir has a different voice. But then once the choir conductor gets in the play, he's able to bring all these voices together where it sounds like one. And so I try to do the same thing with my objects. I bring disparate objects together. And by the time I'm done with it, I would like to think that it makes, you know, it has a language of its own, basically.
Thank you. We're getting some more questions, which is very exciting. So we have one about this piece here. They ask, the work on the right looks like a shrine. Are there religious associations there, including with the found objects?
So my mother's name was Yuna. And she was advised to not have me because her heart was torn up from the rheumatic fever when she was a child. And she was only in her 20s. And the doctors pleaded with her, don't do this because you're probably not going to get out of it alive. And so they gave her a very clear choice. Either have an abortion or, you know, face the consequences. Without hesitation is what I'm told later on in life. She made her decision. She said, I'm going to have this child, which turned out to be me. As I grew older, I realized what a tremendous sacrifice mothers make. Because for someone to be willing to face the unknown just to have a child, I don't know, I could do it. I'd probably say, yeah, it's just not meant to be, you know, whatever. But she was so, you know, determined that she wanted to give me a chance of life. And so she died shortly after I was born. But the thing that has also driven me over these years is that I have to find a way to say thank you. I have to find a way to honor her. And so I think of her in most pieces that I do, but this one in particular, I call her Yuna, which was my mother's name. And I see her as working with all these different objects, you know, when she was alive. Of course, this is all in my mind. I have no proof or evidence of this, but I see all of these little things as part of her existence, like the shell, she lived near the open water, you know, the turtle, long life and patience, but she never had the chance to enjoy that long life, you know, and her eyes, the only thing I really got really right was her eyes on this one. I mean, it has a kind of vague resemblance, but I think I got the eyes right. And it's a very powerful painting for me because it's really the first painting I've done just with her in mind. And the magic that she represented, the love that she represented, the mystery that she represented. I see all of those things in her. And so if you want, you could call this piece kind of my gratitude piece. You know, the piece that I wanted to say, well, Mom, you know, I'm not very good at portraits, but this is my interpretation of the way I see it as someone with good medicine. And I might add that I believe she watches over me. Because every person that I've spoken to growing up, they used to stop me in the streets maybe 10 years old. And they would, some of the old women in the town would call me motherless, and they would always give me money for candy. And back then my teeth was pearly white and my eyes were pearly white, and they would ask me to smile for them, and they would pay me just for smiling, and you know, stuff like that. And so, you know, yeah, this is my gratitude piece.
Thank you. So we have another. How have your own experience as an artist helped you perceive others' art?
Maybe in terms of just understanding the process a little bit more, you know, the patience, the focus that is required. So because of that, I try my best not to poo-poo other people's work. You know what I mean? I try to be respectful to other people's work because, first of all, there is no have to in art. You don't have to do art in one way or the other, you know. But secondly, I look a little bit deeper, but I'm respectful because I don't feel as if my vision is going to necessarily explain, you know, what's in front of me. You know, I just have to project my own interpretation and enjoy it, and that's it. I try not to be judgmental, is basically what I'm saying. I have a deeper appreciation for people's work because, again, I happen to be a painter and I understand the process.
Thank you. So another question about the found objects in your work. How do physical objects incorporated into these pieces elevate the viewer's experience? And why are these textures and layers so important to you?
I believe that objects have memory, and I believe that objects have energy. And one way of proving this is that if you walk into a crowd and you throw $100 bill on the ground, you notice you might even have a riot on your hands. That's the energy that comes from that $100 bill. You throw a gun on the ground, and the same thing happens. So there are certain objects that have a certain energy to them, so that the viewer looking at a particular object, the energy of that object might take the viewer along a nostalgic path, which basically means that, let's say, have you ever played jacks as a little girl?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you saw a painting that I did with different Jack's pieces or whatever, you'd probably think of your childhood growing up. The cowrie shell. Cowrie shell, there were cultures where that was also used as a kind of currency. And it was also used for decorative reasons. But somebody who grew up in a family, let's say in Africa, Jamaica, a Native American, they see the cowrie shell and immediately they understand the significance. Even if I just attached it there just for purely decorative reasons, there are people who will see it and just that one little object will take them down a nostalgic pathway. So I think that, yeah, I use a lot of bones in my work. I think bones are the receptacles of life. Life once lived within those bones. So I use them in my work, and I think it allows people to identify with, if not the painting, at least that one object.
Well, and how you mentioned earlier that you take these objects that have most often been discarded and that one life is done for that object, you give it new life in your work. In a way, you give it infinite lives because of whoever sees it has a different reaction. And I think that's a really incredible thing.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Sure.
So I have a question here. I am touched by your spiritual connection to your mother. It is also interesting to hear you speak about some objects having energy and a life force of their own. My question is, have you been influenced at any time by a particular religion?
That's a touchy one right there. It sounds very cliche because, I guess everybody says it these days, but it can be cliche and true at the same time, and I think I lean more towards spirituality. I have no particular religion. Maybe I use the wrong word, but I have no religion I'm a slave to. I believe that religion is an artificial construct. I think religion creates division, separates, and it creates classifications which are sometimes very condemning and elitist about other people's lifestyle. And so I view religion with a great deal of suspicion. But I also believe that it has its good parts, because I believe the Bible has things in it that can be helpful and relevant. So is the Torah. So is the Quran. So I don't have any particular dogma. I believe my ultimate, or should I say, the ultimate commandment, in my humble opinion, is to treat others the way you would like to be treated. And I think if you can do that, then you transcend religion. We all want the same thing for our children, which is a warm place to stay and to be safe and security and to be not go hungry. That's a universal wish. And so from a spiritual point of view, it helps me to be more accepting of others and not to think that I have the answers to everything because it's in some book that I'm reading. I believe in flexibility, I believe in compassion, I believe in empathy, I believe in all these things. And I think being a spiritual person does not restrict me in terms of following one particular dogma. I like it the way I am. But growing up in Jamaica, though, Jamaica has an undercurrent of spirituality because I identify with aspects of the Rastafarian philosophy, which is one love, means that we're one planet. We're one people. We have one creator. I assume we have one creator. And we're one family, and so it's one love. You know, it's not I accept you based on what you look or what, you know, or who you are, who you're related to as family or whatever. It's nothing like that. It's just seeing you as one entity, one human family, one love. So I don't get into this whole artificial thing about, you know, honestly, I probably get in trouble for saying this, but as I get older, I'm starting to understand too that race is an artificial construct. You know, I don't think the creator sees race. I think the creator sees family, human beings. Might sound a little bit oversimplified, but that's the way I see it.
Thank you so much. I think we have about 4 minutes left and there's one more question. So I'd like to give everyone their chance. And so this kind of goes back to your influence of Japanese belief in life to objects. But Enoch wants to know, have you considered trying the Japanese brush style sumi-e into your work or experimenting with different types of brush?
So far, I have not, only because I've never heard of it, but no, you can assure him I'll be looking into it.
Okay. All right, I think those are all of our questions and everyone had an opportunity to ask theirs. People are very gracious and grateful in the chat for your time and we're very appreciative. So Rich Holly says that was beautiful. And Ryan Kellum says, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. I love hearing his insight and he's very grateful. So.
And I want to say before we go that I'm deeply grateful to North Carolina State University, to the Gregg Museum, to my friend Roger Manley and his very competent and helpful staff for including me in the show, and for the curator, Tasha Gregg Grantham, for the work she has done. So again, thank you for hosting me. Thank you for, my son says I should never say this, but I'll say it anyway. Thank you for seeing value in what I do, you know, and yeah, this has been an experience I will not soon forget. Thank you for the honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Athlone.
Thank you all for joining us and for your questions. We hope to see you at our next virtual program next week. We'll be joined with artist Renee Stout. So thank you so much.